The boardroom on the 42nd floor of Harrison Financial Group fell silent when Jerome Washington presented the audit findings that would destroy 13 careers and expose $53 million in stolen pension funds. They said a black man couldn't run finance, but they never said he couldn't destroy it. For 8 years, Jerome Washington had endured the subtle slights, the questioning glances, and the whispered doubts about his qualifications as Senior Vice President of Internal Audit at Harrison Financial Group. At 34, he was the youngest black executive in the company's 90-year history, a fact that wasn't lost on anyone who walked the mahogany-paneled halls of their Manhattan headquarters. What they didn't know was that Jerome's methodical mind and relentless attention to detail would become their downfall. The morning of March 15th began like any other for Jerome. He arrived at his corner office at 6:30 a.m., an hour before most executives, carrying his usual black coffee and the weight of proving himself worthy of his position. The Harrison Financial Group tower stretched 60 floors into the New York skyline, its glass facade reflecting the morning sun like a monument to American capitalism. Inside, 2,000 employees managed retirement funds for teachers, firefighters, police officers, and municipal workers across 17 states. Ordinary people who trusted their life savings to the stewardship of extraordinarily wealthy men. Jerome's secretary, Patricia Chen, had left a stack of quarterly reports on his desk the previous evening. As head of internal audit, Jerome's job was to ensure that every dollar flowing through Harrison Financial was accounted for, every transaction legitimate, every investment properly documented. It was tedious work that most executives avoided, preferring the glamour of client meetings and strategy sessions. But Jerome found comfort in numbers. They didn't lie, didn't judge, and didn't care about the color of his skin. The first irregularity appeared in the Henderson Municipal Employees Pension Fund quarterly report, a discrepancy of $47,000 between reported holdings and actual assets. Jerome frowned, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses as he cross-referenced the figures with the master database. Mistakes happened, but not usually in his department. He made a note and continued reviewing. By noon, Jerome had identified 6 similar discrepancies across different pension funds, totaling nearly $300,000. His pulse quickened as he pulled up the electronic trail of transactions. Each discrepancy led back to the same source: Pinnacle Investment Management, a subsidiary shell company that reported directly to the executive committee. Jerome leaned back in his leather chair, staring out at the Manhattan skyline. In his 8 years at Harrison Financial, he'd built a reputation for thoroughness that bordered on obsession. His colleagues joked that Jerome could find a missing penny in a billion-dollar portfolio, but this wasn't a missing penny. This was a pattern. The executive elevator carried Jerome to the 58th floor, where the firm's leadership occupied offices larger than most apartments. He knocked on the mahogany door bearing the nameplate, Thomas Mitchell, Chief Financial Officer. At 52, Mitchell was everything Jerome was not: white, wealthy, and connected to old money that stretched back generations. His corner office overlooked Central Park, its walls lined with photographs of Mitchell shaking hands with senators, governors, and Fortune 500 CEOs. "Jerome," Mitchell said without looking up from his computer screen, "what brings you to the executive floor?" Jerome placed the quarterly reports on Mitchell's expansive desk. "I've identified some discrepancies in our pension fund holdings. Nothing major, but worth investigating." Mitchell glanced at the papers, his expression unchanged. "Discrepancies?" "Roughly $300,000 across 6 funds, all traced back to Pinnacle Investment Management." Jerome watched Mitchell's face carefully. In his experience, innocent executives showed concern when audit irregularities were discovered. Guilty ones showed calculation. Mitchell's response was pure calculation. "Pinnacle handles complex derivative instruments for our high-net-worth clients. These discrepancies are likely timing differences related to settlement dates." He slid the reports back across the desk. "I'll have my team review the transactions and provide clarification by end of week." Jerome nodded, but something in Mitchell's tone felt rehearsed. "I'd like to audit Pinnacle's books directly, standard procedure for subsidiary oversight." "That won't be necessary." Mitchell's voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to immediate obedience. Pinnacle operates under special regulatory guidelines. External audits require approval from the executive committee. As Jerome rode the elevator back to his floor, he felt the familiar weight of being dismissed, diminished, and doubted. But this time, the feeling was accompanied by something else: suspicion. In 8 years of internal audits, no subsidiary had ever been off limits. That evening, Jerome remained in his office long after the cleaning crews had finished their rounds. Using his administrative access to the firm's central database, he began tracing every transaction connected to Pinnacle Investment Management. What he discovered over the next 6 hours would haunt him for months. Pinnacle wasn't just handling complex derivatives. It was systematically siphoning money from pension funds managed by Harrison Financial. The scheme was elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its scope. Small amounts, never more than 1% of any fund's assets, were transferred to Pinnacle under the guise of rebalancing investments or optimizing returns. The stolen money was then moved through a series of shell companies before ultimately landing in personal accounts controlled by 5 members of Harrison Financial's executive committee. Jerome printed every document, every transaction record, every email that mentioned Pinnacle. By 3 a.m., he had assembled a paper trail that revealed the theft of $53 million over 4 years. The victims weren't wealthy investors who could absorb losses. They were teachers in Ohio, firefighters in Tennessee, police officers in Michigan, people who had worked 30-year careers with the promise that their pension funds would provide security in retirement. The architects of the scheme were men Jerome saw every day in the elevator, nodded to in the hallway, sat across from in budget meetings. Thomas Mitchell, the CFO who had dismissed Jerome's initial findings. Richard Thompson, Senior Vice President of Investment Management. Jonathan Harrison III, grandson of the firm's founder and current CEO. Margaret Williams, Head of Client Relations. Catherine Anderson, General Counsel. 5 executives had stolen the life savings of 12,000 retirees. Jerome's hands trembled as he organized the evidence into manila folders. For 8 years he'd endured their condescension, their subtle racism, their constant questioning of his competence. They had underestimated him because they saw only his skin color, not his Harvard MBA or his forensic accounting expertise. Their prejudice had blinded them to the one person in the building capable of exposing their crime. The next morning, Jerome requested meetings with each of the 5 executives under the pretense of routine pension fund reconciliation. He wanted to look them in the eye, to see if guilt registered on faces that had smiled at him while they stole from working-class families. His first meeting was with Margaret Williams in her corner office on the 57th floor. At 48, Williams had built her career on charm and competence, managing relationships with union representatives and municipal officials who trusted Harrison Financial with their members' futures. Her office walls displayed certificates of appreciation from teachers' unions, firefighter associations, and police benevolent societies, organizations whose members she was systematically robbing. Jerome, Williams smiled warmly, gesturing to the chair opposite her desk. Patricia mentioned you wanted to discuss pension fund reconciliation. I hope everything is in order. Jerome placed a single transaction record on her desk, a transfer of $67,000 from the Teachers Retirement Fund of Ohio to Pinnacle Investment Management. Can you help me understand this transfer? Williams studied the document, her expression professionally neutral. Standard rebalancing transaction. We move funds between investment vehicles to optimize returns based on market conditions. The transfer was made on December 23rd, Jerome noted. Markets were closed for Christmas week. What market conditions were you responding to? For the first time in 8 years, Jerome watched Margaret Williams hesitate. The silence stretched between them like a chasm, filled with the weight of 53 million stolen dollars and 12,000 betrayed retirees. I'd need to review the specific market analysis that guided that decision, Williams finally replied. My team can provide documentation by next week. Jerome nodded and retrieved the document. That would be helpful. I'll be conducting similar reviews with the other executive committee members. Williams's composure cracked for just a moment, a flash of fear that confirmed what Jerome already knew. She was guilty, and she knew he was closing in. Similar meetings with Thompson, Anderson, and Harrison III followed the same pattern. Professional explanations that crumbled under basic scrutiny. Promises to provide documentation that Jerome knew didn't exist. The gradual realization that their comfortable world of privilege and power was about to collapse. His final meeting was with Thomas Mitchell, the CFO who had first dismissed Jerome's findings. Mitchell's office felt like a shrine to corporate success. Awards from financial publications, photographs with politicians, a signed baseball from the Yankees owner. Behind Mitchell's desk hung a portrait of his great-grandfather, one of the robber barons who had built American fortunes on the backs of ordinary workers. Jerome placed the complete audit trail on Mitchell's desk, 4 years of transaction records showing the systematic theft of pension funds. I've completed my investigation into Pinnacle Investment Management. Mitchell stared at the documents without touching them. When he finally looked up, his expression carried none of the condescension Jerome had endured for 8 years. Instead, there was recognition, the acknowledgement that Jerome Washington, the black executive they had underestimated, held their fate in his hands. What do you want?" Mitchell asked quietly. The question hung in the air like a confession. Jerome had anticipated this moment during his sleepless nights assembling evidence. He had imagined the satisfaction of watching powerful men beg, the vindication of proving his worth by destroying theirs. But sitting across from Mitchell, Jerome felt only sadness for the 12,000 retirees who would learn their life savings had been stolen by people they trusted. "I want you to return every stolen dollar," Jerome replied, "and I want you to confess to federal authorities." Mitchell laughed bitterly. "You have no idea what you're dealing with. The executive committee controls this firm. We control your career, your future, your life. Walk away now, and you'll be promoted to executive vice president by Christmas. Push this forward, and you'll never work in finance again." Jerome stood, gathering the documents from Mitchell's desk. "I've already contacted the Securities and Exchange Commission. Federal agents will be here Monday morning with search warrants." Mitchell's face went pale. "You sanctimonious son of a bitch. You think this is about justice? This is about a bitter black man who couldn't handle being told no." The racist mask finally slipped completely, revealing the contempt that had always lurked beneath professional courtesy. Jerome felt a moment of clarity. This wasn't about race anymore. This was about right and wrong, about 12,000 working-class families whose trust had been violated by men who believed their wealth made them untouchable. "No," Jerome replied calmly. "This is about $53 million stolen from teachers, firefighters, and police officers. This is about you going to federal prison." Jerome walked to the elevator, leaving Thomas Mitchell alone with the wreckage of his criminal empire. Federal agents arrived at Harrison Financial Group at 8 a.m. on Monday morning, armed with search warrants and accompanied by forensic accountants from the SEC. Jerome met them in the lobby, his 8 years of evidence organized into bankers' boxes that would become exhibits in federal court. The investigation moved swiftly. Within 72 hours, all 5 members of the executive committee had been arrested on charges of conspiracy, wire fraud, and money laundering. The media descended on the story like vultures, drawn by the irresistible narrative of Wall Street executives stealing from working-class pension funds. Jerome became the reluctant face of corporate whistleblowing, fielding interview requests from national news programs and financial publications. But he declined most appearances, preferring to let the evidence speak for itself. The stolen money told the story better than any television interview. $53 million taken from people who couldn't afford to lose it, by people who already had more than they could spend. The criminal trial stretched over 18 months, each revealing new depths of callous greed. Thomas Mitchell had used stolen pension funds to purchase a $12 million estate in the Hamptons. Margaret Williams had funded her daughter's private school education with money meant for retired teachers. Jonathan Harrison III had bought classic cars, rare wines, and art that hung in his Fifth Avenue penthouse, while police officers worried about paying for prescription medications. The sentences reflected the magnitude of their crimes. Mitchell received 22 years in federal prison. Williams got 18 years. Thompson, Anderson, and Harrison each received between 15 and 20 years. Federal judges showed no mercy for executives who had betrayed the trust of working families. But the most satisfying moment for Jerome came during the asset forfeiture hearings, when federal marshals seized everything the conspirators had purchased with stolen money. Watching Mitchell's Hampton estate being auctioned to compensate pension funds felt like justice in its purest form. The recovered assets totaled $47 million, not the full amount stolen, but enough to restore most retirees' accounts to their original value. Jerome personally traveled to Ohio, Tennessee, and Michigan to meet with pension fund representatives, ensuring that every recovered dollar reached the people it had been stolen from. In quieter moments, Jerome reflected on the racism that had made the crime possible. The executive committee had underestimated him because they couldn't see past his skin color to recognize his competence. Their prejudice had created the blind spot that allowed him to investigate freely, to access records they assumed he wouldn't understand, to build the case that destroyed them. The irony wasn't lost on him. Their racist assumptions had ensured their own downfall. Harrison Financial Group didn't survive the scandal. The firm that had managed pension funds for 90 years collapsed within 6 months of the arrests, its remaining assets sold to competitors who promised greater oversight and transparency. 2,000 employees lost their jobs, but federal authorities ensured that all legitimate client accounts were transferred safely to new management companies. Jerome Washington was hired as Chief Compliance Officer at Federal Reserve Bank of New York, where his reputation for uncompromising integrity made him one of the most respected regulators in American finance. He kept a framed photograph on his desk, not of awards or achievements, but of a thank you letter from retired teacher Helen Morrison of Columbus, Ohio, whose pension account had been fully restored thanks to Jerome's investigation. The letter read simply, "Thank you for doing what was right when it would have been easier to do nothing. My grandchildren will have Christmas gifts this year because of your courage." On winter evenings, when Jerome worked late in his Federal Reserve office, he sometimes thought about the 5 executives serving federal prison sentences. Thomas Mitchell, stripped of his wealth and influence, cleaning floors in a minimum security facility. Margaret Williams, the woman who had charmed union representatives while stealing their members' futures, working in a prison laundry. Jonathan Harrison III, whose family name had opened every door in Manhattan, now just another inmate number. They had believed their privilege made them untouchable, their wealth placed them above the law, their connections would protect them from consequences. They were wrong about everything. Most catastrophically, they were wrong about Jerome Washington. The black man they said couldn't run finance had exposed their $53 million scam, sent them to federal prison, and returned stolen money to 12,000 retirees who deserved justice. They thought they'd get away, but no one escapes forever. And if stories like this fascinate you, tales of corporate greed, financial fraud, and justice finally served, then you're exactly where you belong. Hit that like button if this story left you satisfied that justice was done. Subscribe to join our growing community of viewers who can't get enough of watching the powerful fall. And share this with someone who needs to hear that no matter how untouchable they seem, justice always finds a way. What corporate crime story should we uncover next? Let us know in the comments below. Until next time, remember, they thought they'd get away, but they never do.